Hi everyone, welcome back to our speaker series. Before starting, I want to remind you that if you want to keep joining our events, please send an email to heather.branch@yale.edu so you can be added to our mailing list. Having said that, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Nick Couldry. Professor Couldry is the professor of Media, Communications and Social Theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. He's a sociologist of media and culture, and he's interested in how media and communications institutions and infrastructures contribute to various types of orders. He has two new books. One is a book. Its name is Datagraph, the New Colonialism of Big Tech and How to Fight Back. And he has a forthcoming book, which name is The Space of the World, Can Human Solidarity Survive Social Media, and What If It Can't? So, if you want to buy it, you have two options. You can take the flyer that you found next to the book. There you will have a 30% discount if you use the code that you can find there and go online and buy it. Or you can also go to Yale Bookstore where you will find a little display. So, having said that, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Nick Couldry.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here at Yale Law School, and thank you very much, Chinmay and Maria and Heather, for the very warm welcome. I realized I forgot to take out of my bag the new book that isn't yet out in the US, but I'll do that when we get to Q&A. So basically, I could be doing two book talks today. It's been a very unusual year. This is not my normal year. It could have been about Datagraph, which was co-written with Ulysses Mejias from Mexico, but I don't like doing book talks without him here, because this is really joint work. Or I could have been doing a book talk about the new book that is already out in Europe, but is not out in the US for reasons I don't understand. It's coming out mid-December, called The Space of the World, Can Human Solidarity Survive Social Media, and What If It Can't? So that's about reforming social media. So what I'm going to offer you, though, is a completely unique talk that no one's heard before, and is my personal take on what connects the two books. And so I'm going to meditate with you, what is this decolonial perspective, to lead to a slightly broader discussion. You may not agree with the detail of what Ulysses and I say. This is highly contentious. People take different views. But what is at the core of this? That's what's really at stake. That goes beyond me as a person or Ulysses or anyone else as a person. So that's what I'm going to try and do, and I hope my thoughts are going to resonate with you, and particularly with the Majority World Initiative, which I'm extremely excited to hear about and want to hear more about. So there's clearly a great place to delivering this talk, and welcome to the online audience as well. So what I want to do is to start with, now, this was working before, and now it's not working. And in fact, it's not working. Oh, okay, we'll just have to use, no, it's not working at all. It's not working at all. Right, slight technical problem. All right, how did you do that? Doesn't this, oh yeah, okay, all right. Hopefully this will revive itself. What we want to do, yeah, we had a problem. I want to start with what I think we can call the settled view of what's going on with big tech, at least a settled critical view, of course not the settled business view, which is that either surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff, or more radical, Nancy Fraser's 2022 book, Cannibal Capitalism, which basically agrees with some of Zuboff, but says this extraction is limitless and it's going to lead to self-destruction. It's a much more dramatic view than Zuboff of the consequences. But there's still a bigger question. If that's the settled view, if you're being critical, is that enough? What is colonialism's relation to all of this? The word's not used. It's very unclear. And yet that's really strange, because obviously attention to colonial history, racial capitalism, settler colonialism is rising, as it should be. So why are we not connecting the two things up? In fact, Zuboff does make a passing link to the early history of colonialism in her book, which is good. Nancy Fraser, as we'll come back to, actually refuses any connection back to colonialism, except where there's a racial thing going on, as there often is, and of course that's the result of previous colonialism. But she refuses any space for colonialism inside her theory of settler capitalism, which, of cannibal capitalism, which I think is a problem, as we'll come to. So what I want to do is unsettle this settled account and reflect on what's at stake in doing so. Now, it's hard to deny that there must be some way in which capitalism emerged out of colonialism. The reason I say that is even Marx, who's often accused of denying any of that, if you look towards the end of Volume 1 of Capital, the section on the origins of the industrial capitalist, he says an incredible thing. He says that colonialism was the strange god that overturned all the objects of previous societies and installed profit at the center. It's a really dramatic statement towards the end of Volume 1 of Capital. So at least it's worth investigating a little further. And I want to do this by showing you a letter. This letter was written in 1610 by two people we don't care about. Sir John Davis writing to the Earl of Salisbury, who was a guy close to the English king at the time. Let me just read the letter first. Sir John Davis says, His Majesty, the King, is bound in conscience to use all lawful and just courses to reduce his people, it means transform them, from barbarism to civility. Civility cannot be planted amongst them by a mixed population. It stands neither with Christian policy nor conscience to suffer so good and fruitful a country to lie waste like a wilderness. What was he talking about? He was talking about the first colonization, which was in England, which was the English colonization of Ireland. And believe it or not, the word plantation was the word when settlers from England went to settle Ireland. And he's saying a mixed plantation is no good. We just have to take over because we have to make use of the land. And why this is so interesting, apart from the extraordinary use of the word plantation, which sends shivers down your spine now, is that he was anticipating by 70 or 80 years what became settled colonial theory in John Locke. In his second treatise of government, he said, in the beginning, all the world was America. Indigenous people are not using the land right. We have to go there and take it from them so that it could be used right and God will be happy. This became the settled justification, the rationalization of colonial expansion. But there it is already anticipated in 1610. Now, why is this so interesting? And by the way, Julie Cohen in the chapter 2 of her famous book, Between Truth and Power, starts with that John Locke quotation. But I only recently discovered this earlier letter. As you'll notice, I discovered it in a book on the origin of capitalism by a Marxist critic, Ellen Mike Sinswood. And she's looking for when did capitalism really start, which is, and let's go beyond Marx. Where did it really start? And it's an incredibly interesting book. She draws her own conclusion from this, that there must be something more going on here than saying, well, colonialism got all the money in, that created the conditions for something like capitalism to take off. That's what Ulysses and I have certainly argued. But she's suggesting something deeper than that. Let me quote her. There can be little doubt that the English colonial experience, first in Ireland, then in the New World, was a major inspiration in English theories of property and value, the basic tools for understanding England's own domestic capitalism. What she's saying is that extractivist way of thinking was already there when the English colonized Ireland. The question is what conclusions we draw from that. As a Marxist, an orthodox Marxist, her conclusion is this is the origin of capitalist imperialism. Because Marx's view was colonialism ended, then you have capitalism, so the sort of colonial things going on can't be colonialism anymore because that's gone, so we call it imperialism. So for her, this is origins how capitalist imperialism was there right at the beginning of capitalism, and colonialism too. Or there's a more obvious interpretation, that this is about the colonial roots of capitalist extraction. Capitalism started with colonialism, not the other way around. Or at very least, that colonialism and capitalism started together, which would suggest, as Ulysses and I argue in our book, you can't separate colonialism and capitalism right from the get-go. There's a sort of double helix that's constantly spiraling, and as I'll be arguing, we're in the latest spiral of that. So I was astonished to find this literally just over the summer. We haven't written about this yet. It's a very, very interesting connection. But it's sort of what we expected. So what I'm going to do in this talk is build on some of the thoughts that Ulysses and I had in the 2021 article when we tried to go beyond our theory and look overall, what is this decolonial approach, taking account of other people too? And that follows into our latest book, Data Grab, which was mentioned. And just to emphasize, this is my personal perspective. Ulysses may or may not agree. He's not here to contradict me. But we've talked about these ideas a lot, and this is what we're thinking around the book. Okay, now let's get really clear. It's not just us saying these things. Multiple researchers have been onto this for a surprisingly long time. More even than we realized when we did our first work. You constantly make discoveries. Let's summarize a few. Of course, there's the fundamental work on racial capitalism. Gargi Bhattacharya, one of the clearest books, which makes a super clear link back to colonialism. There's also Tracy Cottom's work, which links racial capitalism to information. Then there's critical computing studies, and here I have been making some discoveries. We were aware that Lilia Rani was doing pioneering work in the early 2010s about a post-colonial take on computer labor, but not a bigger theory of colonialism, but certainly a strongly post-colonial take. A few years ago, discovered an amazing piece by the STS scholar, Paul Durish, which is called The Colonial Aspects of Ubiquitous Computing. We'll come back to him in a moment. It's an absolutely amazing piece. And you can go, and there's also Mustafa Ali's very important work from a few years later. And you could even go back earlier in STS to a great piece by Sheila Jasanoff on empires of legibility, which, like Durish, talks about botany as a science which emerged in the empire, biotech, they emerge out of an imperial setting. And even Lucy Suchman occasionally talks about the colonial aspects of big tech. So there is a history in STS, which I'm discovering more and more of. And then there's critical geography. The actual term data colonialism was invented by some geographers, Jim Thatcher and others, who saw it just as a metaphor, but it's still an important piece. And then finally, there are those who talk about digital colonialism, Renata Avila, from Central America, Michael Quet. There are some differences between our view and Michael Quet's, but I don't have time to go into those. So there are lots of people saying something similar. So when I develop this argument, I'm not arguing necessarily for mine. It's much more important to get clear, what's this space of thinking in if we want to develop a decolonial process? That's what really matters. But if you are interested in how Ulysses and I do it, there's the book, another picture of it. Okay, and that book built on the previous one, The Cost of Connection, which is more academic. This one is for any undergraduate. It's written for every member of the public to read this. So if you're interested, recommend it to your family or undergrads, or whatever. Okay. Now, I haven't got time to go through every aspect of our data colonialism framework. You can ask me more questions. There's a lot to say. What I want to do instead is take a slightly broader view and contextualize it by highlighting three absolutely key dimensions to the decolonial turn for thinking about big tech. The first is more familiar, which is to remind us that there are continuing racial inequalities in how tech operates. Lots of famous references. You will already be familiar with this, I'm sure. Often this is discussed without mentioning colonialism. Sometimes it's mentioned with an explicit reference to colonialism. But it's really important. The second approach is the one that we particularly emphasize in our title of our book, which that because colonialism originally was a land grab, why wouldn't it be possible there could be a later land grab? Except it wouldn't be land, it would be human life, taken in the form of data. That's, in a sentence, the argument of our book. Taking things was very important for colonialism too. In fact, if there hadn't been any taking things, the rest wouldn't have mattered. It's taking things that was made possible by their violence, the racism, and so on. They were the means to achieve the end, which was to take things. And then there's a third element, which I'm going to say more about, which is more in terms of ideas. The rationalization of this taking and the racism and the inequality that results as something that's just right, that the global north has a right to, because it has a superior privileged relation to rationality. This is something that we think is fundamental to this, but it's less talked about. It's less obvious in a way, but it's very much still present in relation to AI, as we will come back to. So Ulysses and I talk about all three. I think it's fair to say that we're distinctive in that we give emphasis, because we think they're less emphasized, to the second and the third, rather than the first, which is well known. And there's also a fourth element as well, you could say, which is the neo-colonial aftermath of the collapse of the colonial powers, the imperial powers. It's still shaping our unequal global economy and the racism everywhere. So that's a fourth dimension, if you like, which of course is also very important because it interacts with what's new here. Okay, let's stay with this third point because it is less familiar. And here I'm going to go back to this piece by Paul Durisch from 2012, Ubi Comp as a colonial enterprise, I think is the title. It's an astonishing piece because there he brings out that colonialism always had this knowledge aspect. One of the rationalizations for taking everything was to say, well, we know more than you. So you just have to let us take it. And he makes that really explicit, and I think that's useful. But I found also that Sheila Jasanoff was already doing the same thing in 2006 in an essay on empires of legibility, which is, so there is a very interesting line of work that's been rather neglected. This links to the work of my dear Mexican friend, Paula Ricalte, on epistemic violence as a core aspect of data colonialism. Strongly agree with that. And she's going back to the great Peruvian sociologist, Aníbal Quijano, who argued that over and above the material aspects of colonialism, there's the mental aspect. There's the dominance in ways of thinking, colonialidad. Coloniality is a way of thinking that says it's entitled to take everything. And this has 500 years of roots of history as well, as we've already been seeing in that letter I showed you at the start. And these things are not just ideas, they're brutally, practically important. And we know this from looking at an account by a discredited person in a way, the great political theorist Carl Schmitt, but also a Nazi, who after the end of the Second World War, when he was extremely disappointed that Nazism had lost and colonialism had failed, he wrote a book about what that meant. It was the end of the world as far as he was concerned. The book, The Nomos of the Earth, says at one point, explaining what colonialism really was, he says, the intellectual advantage was entirely on the European side, so much so that the New World could simply be taken. So that's a direct use of privileged rationality in the global north to justify, thank you, we'll take everything. Okay, let's keep that broader point in mind because I think it's very important. And now I'll summarize more broadly the sorts of advantages we see to a decolonial perspective, Ulysses and myself. And there are various sorts of advantages over just seeing this as something going on within capitalism. The first is it broadens our scope of what there is to talk about. It broadens the topical scope. And this links to what I think is a difficulty in Zuboff's book, admirable though it is in various ways. She sort of writes as if the problem is rogue capitalism, certain guys in Silicon Valley who went rogue, particularly in Google and Facebook. That's my impression of the book, but I found a sentence where that's super clear. She says on page 22, when a firm collects behavioral data, when it does that with permission and solely as a means to product or service improvement, it's committing capitalism. That's totally fine. It's not doing surveillance capitalism. And in fact, she'd written a book, as Yevgeny Morozov pointed out in a very smart review, published within a few weeks of her book. She'd written a book 20 years before called the support economy, which said that constant gathering of data from customers was the way forward for capitalism. So there's nothing wrong with that. Whereas under the decolonial approach, we're not held back in any way from saying it's the whole thing. It's every dimension of capitalism that is the problem. So the second advantage is that it obviously gives us a longer historical time frame. I just quoted from a letter from 1610, which you might not think had any relevance to what Mark Zuckerberg was thinking in 2004, but I think there's a really close connection. So we have a longer historical continuity, which means we can move beyond the rather strange position of Nancy Fraser in her excellent book, Settler Capitalism, which basically denies there can be any continuity between early colonialism and capitalism. She actually says at one point, colonialism is simple theft, it's pillaging, it's just taking stuff. Capitalism is much more structured, it's ordered and so on. It's a different thing. Well, I'm not sure I know the difference, really. Someone takes everything you got. I don't care what you call it. It's taking everything. That's what matters. For me, that's a continuity. But she denies that continuity. So what we can do under the decolonial approach is we can recognize, why not recognize the common roots of capitalist extractivism, which goes on everywhere, and colonialist extractivism. And this is exactly the point that Julie Cohen makes in her wonderful book, Between Truth and Power. She's not there to talk about colonialism, but we were just developing our word at the same time. We knew of each other's work. She uses informational capitalism, fine, but she does make that point, and she had done for a few years in the wonderful chapter, what became chapter 2 of Between Truth and Power. I think this is a more useful way forward, to see the two as connected. Then there's a third advantage of the decolonial frame, which, because we're talking about colonialism, which obviously was global, that was the point of colonialism. It was a global power grab. It no longer makes sense to just base our analysis about what's going on in the so-called West or even Silicon Valley. We have to think on a global scale, in which, as I said before, colonialism and capitalism work together all the time in what we call a double helix. Two examples of perspectives that would support that from historians, actually. The Harvard historian Sven Beckert, A Brilliant History of Cotton, absolutely sees cotton as not as something that was taken and processed in the West, but a whole way of organizing the world's resources, involving many players across the world, in which colonialism was integral to it in fueling capitalism. You can't separate the two in his model of how cotton became a crucial asset in the 19th century. And then black Marxist critics for decades have been criticizing orthodox Marxism for completely ignoring the reality of colonialism, which of course, as we know, actually went on growing during the 19th century. The slave plantations were getting bigger, getting more efficient, at the same time as they were also fueling the growth of English industrial capitalism. And Cedric Robinson, one of the leading black Marxist critics in his book, Black Marxism from 2000, himself goes back to 17th century colonial Ireland, which is quite interesting. So these connections have been known for a long time, but not talked about. So how does this is very theoretical, I know, you may be impatient for me to get more practical. How does this help us understand the phrase on everyone's lips, AI, artificial intelligence? I think it helps us quite a lot. And as I said, this is something we definitely emphasize in our new book, Data Grab, which was written as Gen AI was becoming a thing. The first book was written before Gen AI, obviously. None of us anticipated it. So have a look at the new book for how we deal with AI in particular. But let's think about AI from this decolonial perspective. First thing we clearly know is that LLMs, just like previous forms of algorithms on a simple level, reflect the racism and the racial inequality in wider society. In fact, it's not very easy for mathematicians to get that out. It's extremely difficult to get racism out of the large language models, any more than it is to get patriarchy out. That's the first point, and Nabiba Behan has a good paper on that. Secondly, it's obvious that AI's inputs, particularly when we think about Gen AI, which we're all using or thinking about using, clearly doesn't just take surveillance assets, which is what Zuboff said, that's the deed, taking the surveillance assets that you gave up when you thought you were having fun, but someone's surveilling you, you're going to take that and do something. No, you could have been making a song, writing a novel, doing a blog, doing anything, chatting, commenting, restaurant review, anything now can be taken. Those are not really surveillance assets. It's the whole of human communication and creativity. Easy to make sense of that within the idea of a land grab or data grab doesn't obviously fit within Zuboff's model. And then it's transparent that AI is a knowledge enterprise. It's a redefinition of knowledge. What else is it except a knowledge enterprise, as Paul Durisch called it? That is imposing one version of rationality over others, which is exactly what Quijano said coloniality was. I've seen ads on the Financial Times which say, I can't remember the exact phrase, but since this is a law school, it's something like, it's not that lawyers have to use AI, but it's not that AI will replace the law, but lawyers who use AI will replace the lawyers who, shock horror, don't use AI. That is close to blackmail, really, in an advert for Lexus on the Financial Times. That is imposing one rationality on another. And also we could go further and see this in a global and colonial way and saying these are spatially specific elites that are behind this, that are trying to govern how the world produces knowledge in what I think is very easy to see as a colonial way. And this is exactly what Paolo Ricalti says in a later piece on hegemonic AI. Now, I recognize there's a lot of exciting things happening through AI. I'm not denying that for one moment. Who doesn't want protein structures to be found out faster than humans are capable of? Who doesn't want the genetic profile of dangerous diseases to be found out quicker than humans can do it? Of course, that's computation, which can be used to a good end. I'm not denying that for a moment. But in the midst of all those positive effects, which are constantly hyped, it's very easy to lose sight of what else is going on socially. I just want to give you one quotation which brings this clearly home. This is from evidence that OpenAI gave to the UK House of Lords in the fall of 2023, when someone, Sam Altman or someone else, said, it would be impossible to train today's leading AI models without using copyrighted materials. If you or I had said that, private individuals, we'd go to jail because we were threatening a crime, right? But when the leader of OpenAI comes to the House of Lords, that's a business model. It's innovation. Something very strange is going on here. And we'll come back to that. But that's AI, and let's go back in history and think, let's not forget about social media. It's still having consequences for people's lives. Let's think about how we look at social media from a decolonial perspective. And obviously, I recognize that social media has some very distinctive features. There's a very particular type of rabbit hole that societies went down, and my new book is about that rabbit hole. And some of those don't need to concern us here. But at the core of the very possibility of social media was the idea that engineers, by writing code, could just take human social life and treat it as a domain they could exploit to generate advertising income. No one thought that was a problem. Again, I would suggest that is a colonial idea, but in a radically new domain, happening in the global north, conceived, of course, by the elites in the global north, but potentially happening everywhere where anyone who opens their phone and opens a social media app. It's a colonial idea of the same sort that we've just been discussing from the very beginning. People don't know how to make the most out of social life, our connections. Let's show them how by not conquering land. We'll come back to how it is in a moment. Well, by designing a new space. A platformed space of the world, which is the title of my book, that was there designed in such a way that it could be optimized for data and profit extraction. So again, we've got a question, the same one we keep coming back to. Do we understand this as Zuboff would as simply exploiting surveillance capital? That's a good description as far as it goes. Or will we see it in a much more general way as yet another general capture of what there is to be captured, the capture of life for extraction. By the way, it's worth noting that even surveillance techniques had their origins in colonialism. Fingerprints were invented as part of the English rule of India. So even surveillance is not exactly uncolonial, but that's a side story. The question is, right now, what do we emphasize? The broader colonial continuity, or something about a little bit rogue, a little bit strange that we can correct for in capitalism? I'm back in the continuity. And in fact, this decolonial perspective, because it takes a longer view, because it's not narrowly linked to what were those guys in Silicon Valley doing in 2004, it's free to go much earlier than that. We can see connections we might otherwise see. So in fact, people have been anticipating something like this was going to happen 10 years before social media. Philip Ager's amazing piece from 1994, which I still set for my LSE master's students, Surveillance and Capture, Two Orders of Privacy, pretty well saw the direction of travel 30 years ago. Oscar Gandhi, the great black sociologist, had already written his book a year before, The Panoptic Sword, which was about the gathering of data by corporations from credit card data, airline miles, all these things, as part of a fundamental reorganization of life for capital. He was doing his fieldwork in the 1980s, when things were taking off. And there's also a great piece by a legal scholar, maybe of interest to you, Paul Schwartz, astonishing piece, 1999 Connecticut Law Review. I can't read this, it's just unbelievable what he saw. Internet and the privacy in the state, where he says if you basically have a connected state, a space, which is the internet, and you allow corporations to play in it, you will have surveillance-driven consumption. Unbelievable, that level of insight. So legal theory has been a very important part in seeing the way ahead, and also Judy Cohen did an amazing piece from 2000 called Examined Selves. Again, have a look. So some people were seeing this was going, but they weren't doing it because they were imagining social media was going to come along. They were doing it because they were seeing what was already going on before social media. Social media cannot be the origin of this. In fact, if we look at the early Facebook patents, go to the very beginnings of the Facebook thinking, and I'm doing some work in building a, well, we've got an article under review, to be honest, Zhao and I, at the moment. We hope they like it. Anyway, we've been looking at the early patents of Facebook, where you can see them bit by bit, building a shadow world that has one very simple goal: to ensure that everything you do in it can be counted, and it can be counted relative to a matrix that can establish value that, of course, eventually can be sold to advertisers. But remember, that world has to be built. It's not our world. And it has to be similar enough to our world that we walk in through the door and we don't know the difference. We think we're still having fun with our friends, but we've gone into the shadow world where everything we could possibly do is being counted. They had to build that, and they do that through the patents. They transform real-world information into engineered data structures, and once you've done that, then you can do more engineering on top of that. There's no way out at that point. Anyway, we hope that piece will come out. We'll see what the reviewers think. If there's a reviewer in the room, I'm sorry for breaching protocol, but I feel I wanted to talk about it. Okay. Now, there's a lot more I could say about AI and social media, but let me sum up the argument so far, which is that both the latest AI and the very origins of social media, not even just the worst stuff that came later, can be understood as an order of capture. And we say something similar in our 2019 book, where we say platforms literally produce the social for capital. They produce something that seems like the social in a form that capital can extract from. That's what a platform is, in our view. We developed that a bit more in the recent book, where we theorize this as the creation of data territories. Obviously, it's not land that's being taken, that's being controlled when social media does what it does. It's a particular type of territory that has many of the capturing, controlling features of land when there's an absolute sovereign in charge. And that is a platform. It's a data territory But there are many other types of platforms other than social media in agriculture, education, health. So many areas of life have been reorganized as data territories. AI is, of course, a bit different because we're talking about massively more computing power being used. And that means that large-scale AI is capable of taking the entire web as its territory. Doesn't even have a distinctive feature. It can just literally take all possible territories as its input. And this is something that, if you look at the business literature, is often exactly what is being celebrated. It's not being hidden from us, it's being celebrated. So Thomas Siebel wrote a book in 2019, a sort of airport book, serious business book, called Digital Transformation, where he argued that when you add big data to the cloud, which has to process all this stuff, we can't do it on our individual devices, then the IoT, the Internet of Things, to bring in even more data from things as well, and then you have the AI to process all that, you have a total transformation of the social and economic space, which is what he calls the digital transformation. You could read that, however, as the total form of capture of everything. That's the way I would read it. I'm sure he would not agree with me. Capturing life for business. We can also take the point to a global scale because this changes how we think about China. In Zubov's book, China is the ultimate rogue capitalist because, of course, they love surveillance, they're problematic society, problematic government. Therefore, why wouldn't they take advantage of surveillance assets too? The problem with that is it doesn't really understand what's going on in China, completely misunderstands it. China is not depraved. China is offering another version of the capitalist colonialist digital transformation or order of capture, depending on your language. It's actually doing it in, you could argue, in a more effective way. Much more coherent state policy. If you read, I recommend it, the Chinese state policies, they're extremely clear, cited. And so much so that in a recent 5-year plan, which is luckily translated into English, they say at one point we need to build new sensory infrastructure for Internet of Things data communication. That's exactly what Thomas Siebel was saying. Demonizing China misses the whole point that China has far more similarities than we think with what we're doing. It may just be a smarter version of what we're doing at the policy level. So, we need to take China seriously. And another point is that if you might think, hang on, social media is very different from AI. We can't ignore the way these two are now converging. So if, on my view, you'd saying the deepest problem with social media platforms is not the miniature aspects of design, do they have like buttons or not, it's the whole thing. It's allowing businesses a tool to capture social life. If that's the problem, then things will not get better with AI. Whatever Apple has done to its iPhone conditions to make it harder for Meta to give data to third parties, it's not making any difference because Meta's profits are going up, and the reason is AI. They're using AI more sophisticatedly to pre-package data for the advertisers and sell it as a package. They're using their own AI. Then you would argue, Meredith Whittaker in particular, that this just increases Meta's power. And in fact, rather angry engineers from Google commented when it was leaked that Meta's Lambda model was going to be open source. They said, well, the leaked model was theirs, and that means they can basically garner an entire planet's worth of free labor, because every bit of work you do on the OpenAI, on the Lambda open source so-called model will be stored, of course, by the model, benefiting Meta. I know that's controversial. Some people think that the open source AI is the way to liberate us all and get us all have our hands on AI. But I take the view of Meredith Whittaker that this is not necessarily a good direction. Okay, that's the overall analysis I want to offer. We're getting close to the end. I want to then move to the question of resistance, some hope, hopefully. How does that look when we've reframed everything we're talking about in a decolonial perspective? not just as a development within capitalism. Well, first of all, our resistance has to start from the holistic view. We have to look at the whole digital transformation, not just this or that aspect in this or that part of the world, and see it as an expanding order of capture that is a major new turn in something that's 500 years in the making, the colonialist, capitalist double helix. So it's not enough to resist parts of it. We'll say that's the problem. Fix that and we've solved the problem. That's not going to be. This is the outcome of 500 years of history, accelerating arguing, deepening. We have to take all of that on to think about what resistance means. And we have to foreground, I think, what Durish said 12 years ago, that colonialism's knowledge enterprise is alive and well in the discourse around AI. In fact, AI, the discourse around AI, is actually transforming knowledge itself. That's what's going on. People saying, that doesn't count as knowledge anymore. You're too slow. Don't waste time reading 100 cases by tomorrow morning. I want you to use AI and then look at the summary. This is affecting legal professionals in quite profoundly, as you all be very aware. This is a redefinition of knowledge that's going on in terms that suit capital. Speeding things up, saving labor power, and so on. But the guise is always to advance science, business, and humanity. That's the civilizational story that always gets told about big change when you want to take over a territory. So we need to go beyond the obvious rogue uses of AI in, for example, facial recognition software and so on, messing with people's brains directly, as outlawed by the EU, quite rightly. And we need to be concerned about the much more subtle social consequences, which few people are writing about yet. But there was an interesting piece earlier this year by anthropologists from UPenn and a writer from Harvard, Masseri and Crockett, where they're worried about these longer-term epistemic risks, the damage to the definition of knowledge from us using AI all the time, as we're encouraged to do. Will our work cultures just become monocultures? Basically just about making AI printouts look nice. Is that what we're going to be doing for the rest of time? Of course, that will involve ever more reliance on big tech's computational power. That's going to be a power issue, even if everything else is great, as Whitaker says. The thing I'm starting to work on in a new book is, what are the consequences going to be for our social definition of knowledge? Aren't we here, in fact, discounting human expertise, human intuition even, human knowledge, which is not to say I don't want to delegate to machines to calculate the structure of the next 100 proteins. Of course I do, because humans can't do it fast enough. Where computational power works and we can control it as social beings, that's fine. But when it's something that social beings can do perfectly well, and the only person who gains is the person who gains from no longer paying a wage, I'm not so sure this is something that we should be relaxed about. So policy responses. On social media, I'll be very brutal here. I think we need much more dramatic interventions than we have at the moment. These are discussed in my new book. Regulators need to force social media platforms to change their business models, so that they are no longer exploitative of human resources and human life. Regulators need to impose fair competition. As Cory Doctorow put it, adversarial interoperability. He's not a decolonial perspective, but he makes a superb point in the book from last year, the Internet Con, where he argues that until we are enabled to take all our contacts, all our comments, our threads, our life from a platform we're no longer happy with to a platform we are happy with, you don't have a market. Imagine if you went into a coffee shop, had a nice coffee, and then found some of your friends were there. So let's do this again, but there's another one around the corner, it's quite nice. And then the coffee shop owner says, sorry, you can't meet those friends anywhere except here. I've just created a coffee shop so that you can uniquely meet them here. We would say, that's not a free market, whatever else it is. So why do we think social media is operating in a free market? It's the exact opposite of a free market. So that needs to be changed. Also, governments, I think, need to be involved in some way to force social media platforms to compensate for the damage they've done, to support investment in public communication infrastructures, which could be done through ring-fence taxes, which could, for example, help fund competition to the commercial SMPs, much closer to communities, federated social media, which can't get going because no one can take all their contacts there. And also to fund the revival of public media. Local journalism has been destroyed by social media. Why not tax Google to get it going again? And then there's the much more complex question of policy responses on AI. And this is complex because it's super big and it's evolving very fast and it's relatively new. So I haven't got detailed proposals. I have more of a way of thinking. I think we need to shift the emphasis, and I know a number of people are thinking this, rather than what seems to be the best we have, which is the EU risk pyramid approach. AI is basically good, it needs to be encouraged financially, but there are one or two bad things, some super bad, we regulate for them, otherwise fine. Risk pyramid. What if the key consequences of AI are these more subtle long-term consequences? You're going to miss that through the risk pyramid. And the way to similarly equally want to avoid doing the worst thing, which is to say, well, actually, let's change our laws completely to make AI more possible, which certain countries like Singapore, Estonia, and others have done by building in exceptions to copyright law so that AI innovation can function. That's a problem. Instead, we need to reevaluate AI as potentially this new order of capture that may certainly have good uses, let's take those seriously, but at the same time is going to have fundamental consequences for inequality, power, and society that we really need to think about first before deciding how, as societies, we should be regulating for it. And some people are starting that work, people like Timnit Gebru, Seda Gursas, Abiba Behan, and others, but I think we're only just starting this work. And this is not the approach to AI on offer, even amongst the most enlightened legislatures, such as the EU. So I'd reach in the end. One final brief point. Obviously, if we're going to fundamentally change our attitude to AI, social media, big tech, big data, this is a big task. It's the task of a generation. It's a collective task. But then resisting the big things always has been a collective task. Of course, that's going to be the case. So there is one thing that we can draw from the history of decolonial resistance, which is the power, the continuing power, even under the most extreme circumstances of imagination. This is something that Ulysses and I always stress in our books. Imagination is not just an abstract thing, I fancy things being different. It's a practical tool to say, yes, I believe we can enter into different social relations to big tech. We can imagine such a world. Maybe we could begin to imagine together a path from this world to that world. And I hope in my talk I've contributed in a small way to doing that. So I look forward to your questions. And if you're interested in more, there are the discount codes. Datagraph is already out. The Space of the World will come out in December in the US, I'm sorry, so unless you use a VPN and have someone ship it across the ocean, you've got to wait till mid-December. I'm sorry about that, but I'll get a copy out in a minute if you're curious to have a look at it. Thank you for listening. Please.
So I'm really intrigued by your argument about the continuity of the mode of extraction from colonialism to the current state of powers. But the thing about Zuboff's argument, right, is that she locates the origin of the new mode of extraction quite clearly in the commercialization movement in the early 2000s, which in a way it gives you a really clear instruction of where it comes from, where it happened.
That's
right. And I really buy your argument. Yeah, I think it's more powerful. But then if you start to think of the continuity of extraction, then you start to think about, the knowledge enterprise that brought this about. So then you think about, okay, how then the form of the knowledge enterprise and knowledge organization is also continuous. So then you think, okay, the problem that's happening with AI has to be located with the earlier form of knowledge in statistics.
Yes.
Which makes it really hard now to resist, because how far do you go back to undo all these violence that is causing? So with this as a form of resistance if you start to locate the problem of the epistemic violence in such fundamental knowledges that we are using now, computer science, in everything, right?
Yeah.
How far do we go back and what we have to do?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm not saying that Zuboff is wrong. I mean, clearly she's right about what she says about Facebook and Google. They were doing these things, and that's important to know. It's a very important book. So we're not denying that. It's a question not of or, but and. But we also need to think of the longer-term history of how this is part of a wider set of transformations. For example, in the insurance market. For example, let's look at the way insurance, a very important feature of any well-functioning market economy, is insurance, social pooling of resources to help us when unexpectedly things go wrong. It's pretty difficult to get that sort of insurance anymore because increasingly insurance contracts are operating as surveillance contracts. So if you buy a car, unless you work hard at it, that car will be surveilling everything you do, every time you brake, every time you accelerate. You may not know where that data is stored, but it will be stored in the car and kept with the car company. As came out in a piece in the New York Times recently, people found they couldn't get insurance anymore because that data was then being sold to a data broker who were then, of course, selling it back on to the insurers who were then adjusting the premiums or saying, you're not going to get an insurance policy. So we've got to a situation, and this is not because we entered onto a platform where we were searching for stuff necessarily or using social media. It happened because the whole way any sort of device now is designed is to treat it as an extractable domain. That's completely changed the nature of insurance. So this is happening across society generally. So I think that's one reason you need a broader account. You can see the problem going in more places. So inevitably the solution does become more complex. You're right. Does that mean that we can't go back, that we can't resist? I don't think so. So if we take, okay, AI, many histories of AI do date it with the emergence of Bayesian statistics, of course, the emergence of the mathematics that made Bayesian statistics possible, and so on. But what I'm interested in is the idea of AI as colonial capture. I have nothing against neural nets whatsoever. They're a super smart way of saying when we do not know the pattern in this vastly large set of data points, and no human being could possibly work it out because we don't have enough eyes and the processing capacity, let's use a certain form of statistics to see if we might be able to propose that there is this pattern. And then when we propose it, we can fine-tune it, work with it, and so on. That is fine. I'm not saying there's any problem with that. The problem is that when you apply that technique, which does have a long history, to a way of governing the world, and that is relatively new in its current form, but I'm saying that that way of thinking about the world in an extractivist way has in fact much deeper roots, going back a long time, even though the means, of course, has changed profoundly. So I think that we're resisting the particular form of this. So I think if we get clear about where the problem is and where the problem isn't, I think we can overcome that. I don't know who is first. I genuinely don't know. We'll take all three, obviously. Go for you.
Kind of related to the point and related to what you just said. I think, to me, it feels like so much of what's going on in AI right now is really almost necessitated by a kind of momentum that flows out of the logic of capitalism itself at the very, very, very origin of everything. So I feel pessimistic about small-scale resistance, people being motivated by the right things and acting in this sphere without fundamentally kind of like rethinking the extractive capitalist logic that's been driving history for so long. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, you're right. This is a very, I totally agree with your analysis that this, and just to stress, Ulysses and I are never saying this isn't about capitalism, it's only about colonialism. Our argument is always that it's about both, and that you can't separate the two. It would be crazy to say it wasn't also about capitalism. As you say, there's a certain acceleration now. So when you look at all the talk about AI, it's not just about saving jobs. Sometimes the thing is not to save jobs, but to say you need to do things faster. We can save so much money if you do that using AI. We can do things 100 times faster. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I'm saying it's changing the way management relates to human labor. It's a form of dominating the space of social life that could have really radical implications. Jen Burrell, a sociologist from UC Berkeley, did a piece on algorithms as domination. And I think that's quite insightful. So we need a social take on this. Now, you might say, well, I'm pessimistic about that. Taking on capitalism, no one knows the alternative. That's, at the deepest level, that's one reason why we are adding a colonial frame. Because, of course, colonialism continues, but we do know what it looks like when colonial institutions fall, when imperialism of a certain sort fails. We have seen that in history. It's not been the end of the story, but we have seen it. We have not seen the end of capitalism. So there are ways you can see this is slightly more hopeful. But let me bring it home here in a way that's particularly relevant for a law school. And this is why I think AI is going to lead to some really profound confrontations quite soon. If it's true, if I'm right, and Paul Durish is right, that the colonialism and the knowledge enterprise, and that AI is part of that, and its goal is to redefine what counts as knowledge, redefine it in its own interests, in the interest of capital. And there were some Marxist critics who said similar things too. That means that each one of us in our professional lives is going to have to face this. You're going to be asked to do things the way you don't want to do it. Now, of course, we know how market power could work to force it upon you. But it's quite clear where resistance will be. It will be in how you work, how you think about what it was to qualify as a lawyer, why you did spend all that time reading cases. When the next generation won't bother to read a case, they'll just start with the AI summary. There's a form of de-skilling that is implicit in this, that is profoundly violent to many institutions, including universities, and I think law is one of the most exposed, because it is based around a culture of embodied learning. And judges, those who can read a case, and of course there are pieces showing that Gen AI is not very successful in working out, is this a precedent for that? Because that's an extremely complicated hermeneutic task. They can't do it. They may be 80% hallucinating. So I think this is an example of how it seems super abstract, but actually the point of resistance is very close to home indeed. And we need to think about that, everyone in their own practice, because this is where resistance could start in Yale Law School or in other law schools. So I'm not pessimistic about that, because I think we've only had 2 years of Gen AI, a vast amount has happened, but marketers have found in the US, when you say AI enhanced of a product, people are less likely to buy it. So somewhere people are getting the message. They're not sure. They're not convinced what's really going on here. And I think they're right. So I'm not pessimistic about resistance. Let's go to you.
That's great. This question picks up directly off of that. So I was struck when you talked about the Irish. And then at the bottom of one of those slides, you had kind of a plea for humanism, almost, is what I got from it. And I forget the words exactly used were, but you know, when I think of humanism, I think of kind of individual, solitary, very particular inquiry. But the scope of your project seems to be if this is, I mean, in a Marxist frame, that we need either social or structural kind of solutions or resistance. So I'm just wondering if you can speak about how that all comes together. What kind of space for individual, individualized humanistic knowledge at the same time needing to mount a more thorough or structural resistance?
Yeah, I don't remember the particular slide that you had in mind, but I am a humanist in the sense that as a human being, talking to other human beings, I challenge anyone who says they're not a humanist, doesn't care whether they live or die, doesn't care how their friend or mother dies. I challenge them to say they're not a humanist. There isn't another game in town, which is not to say that we don't take seriously the role of technologies in our lives, and we don't reject a certain type of older humanism that was deeply problematic, of course, and ensconced in the West. Of course, that's problematic. So I am a humanist, but I hope not from an individualist point of view. So we're drawing on, in the book, a number of non-individualistic approaches. I strongly agree, for example, with Julie Cohen's argument that we need a post-liberal definition of privacy, for example. And that comes, if you look at Julie's work, it comes out of social theory and cultural theory, appreciating that privacy has always emerged from social relations. And I'm not sure if she would agree, but I think her position has its roots in the philosopher Hegel, who, whatever his other problems, and he was a great defender of empire and said many disgraceful things, but he also had a very interesting definition of freedom, which we draw on in chapter 5 of The Cost of Connection, which is that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. So the in the other part of the def is relational. You can't be free unless others are also free, those with whom you have relations. Interestingly, Timothy Snyder's book on freedom is making the same point again and again in the book he's just published, without, I think, mentioning Hegel. But Hegel had said this 200 years ago. But even more interesting is the be with oneself. And in The Cost of Connection, we focus on this because that's the idea that when you're thinking about your life, your relation to your loved ones, and so on, there's no one in between you and that thought. There's no machine measuring, do you really love that person? Because last time you said that, well, if there is someone saying it's me thinking about my life, the idea of a machine externally, some corporation, is profoundly violent to even the very possibility of freedom. Hegel said that bodily separateness is the only starting point for freedom. We call it the space of freedom in the book. And I think that is being damaged now. But of course, you see, we put that in a relational way. And because we're in a decolonial framing, we also draw on Latin American thinkers who said very similar things. There's a lot more in common here between Latin American thinking and thinking from around the world and what so-called Western thinking that we might believe. And so we try and draw on that in the way we cite and who we draw on and so on. So thank you for picking up on that. Yeah, you're quite right. I'm a humanist. You had a question, I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful and stimulating talk. Really enjoyed it. I also really appreciated your challenge of Sukov's argument. I'm a scholar of China, technology in China, so I've had similar, took similar issues with the argument. And I guess my question comes from this place of, I work in a kind of space of science and technology studies, STS, which you cited in China scholarship. And I've always been interested in this feminist project of how can technology be otherwise. And I think this is where you kind of ended the talk with a call for imagination. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. I've been thinking a lot about this current moment where there's such an antagonistic view on China. There's only one truth. For instance, as you mentioned, right, sort of China is the scary, other perfected surveillance state. And I've been working really hard to intervene in some of these conversations in DC, where I try to spark imagination about other ways of perceiving China, for instance, or even just the relationship between the US and China, right? And it's been very challenging. There's very little room for imagination. And so I really appreciate your point about we need other forms of storytelling, and I think you're doing that. And so one just very pragmatic question for you, how would you talk to someone, a policymaker? We're here in the law school, obviously, these are people who think often in conversation, with future legislation. And so bringing in the imagination is something we don't often do when it comes to legislation, but how would something like imagination, fiction, or I don't know where you were going with this, but what would be your proposal to that?
Well, I mean, I imagine these are very difficult conversations, and obviously the geopolitical situation is not favorable for imagining something different right now for many reasons, and also the US political situation is hardly favorable. So it's particularly difficult right now, but imagining it in a slightly better place to just have the conversation. Well, I think one would clearly respect those who want to put first and foremost their dislike for the intensity of surveillance in Chinese society. I have many, many Chinese students. 30, 40, 50% of my class doing my course on data and social order are from China. And we talk about China a lot, and they want to come to London to have those conversations. So I take that extremely seriously, and I feel their pain. Having lived through the pandemic, they have profound pain in living through that time under the most intense surveillance conditions we can imagine. So the first thing is to take that really seriously, to take China's experience seriously. The second thing is to take China seriously in the sense that it was until very recently, it's not quite anymore the largest society in the world. India has just overtaken it. But it has been the largest society in the world for a very long time. And therefore those whose role, whatever their motives and problems in trying to govern China, face extraordinarily complex challenges. And that has to be respected. I think one should start from some sort of respect. The third thing will be to start to ask people to read the policy documents. They're all translated by Roger Creamer's and team based in, I think, Oxford or Brussels. They're all there. They're very coherent, very interesting. They have been for 10 or 15 years, planning out what an internet society will look like. We may not like it, but ironically, when they designed the notorious social credit system, they describe it in that policy document as a market improvement of the social and economic order. So two things are interesting. A, they're honest. This is about order. This isn't about freedom. Let's stop the nonsense about freedom. This is about ordering the world, governing it better. And secondly, they're very happy with the market improvement, because governments don't have the time to do that. They're thinking about the governing, the order that generates from what markets do. So they're very clear about that. So I think it's important to look at the policy documents. It's also important to think about what TikTok is. TikTok, I think, is very problematic. But it's problematic because it's the most advanced form yet of the same business model that Meta was developing. It doesn't need a social graph anymore because it can gather so much information by watching what you do under the laboratory slide, as it were, the microscopic slide as you move around when stuff is sent at you. That's all it needs. It doesn't need a social graph anymore. It already has enough data. That is a refinement of the Meta business model. And it's very problematic because it is guaranteed to generate problems like addiction. So people are right to say there's a problem, but the way they're doing it, because it happens to come from China, is nonsense, because it was developed in competition with Meta. And it's being used by a lot of people over here anyway, who enjoy aspects of it. So I think we need to reframe these things in terms of what's actually happening in China. What do the policy documents say? Let's take their challenges seriously. Imagine that some of them are also our challenges, the social consequences of addiction of social media. China led the way in the world in trying to regulate children's uses of TikTok. Why are we not hearing about that? Why can't we say sometimes we can learn from China? This will be the way to reframe it, but obviously it needs a slightly more auspicious moment than the current one to have that. But I think it's great work you're doing. It's really important. I know you had a question there in the center.
Yeah, I'm from China. So like I have a question. Do you think there's a dilemma or paradox of the innovation of hardware and the algorithm, and as well as the big data? So the authoritarian nature of governments, like in China, which means they could be like very convenient or easy to get all the personal data and to use the data to train AIs to do things on that. But at the same time, the authoritarian nature of government also discourage the innovation of algorithm and hardware. So given America has banned China from a lot of advanced microchips, so do you think there's gonna be dilemma where we never meet the goal? Because in US we cannot access all the personal information and data, but in China they cannot access the hardware and software of AI training.
Well, it's a good question. We obviously don't know how these battles over cloud computing, production of chips are going to play out. There's a massive battle going on between China and the US at the moment over that, and other parts of the world are trying to find a pathway in between that. So we don't know how that's going to be resolved practically. And clearly we do want some innovation in relation to AI. The innovation that led to the neural nets was mathematics and issues around designing flows of information and correction and so on. Form of mathematics built on statistics and so on. I'm not in any way against that, and clearly it can be applied in good ways. For example, to better predict male violence against women will be a good use for it. So we can imagine good uses for this. I think this general language, and I mentioned the World Economic Forum policy document which came out this week or last week, just seems to say innovation in general must be allowed. Well, that's innovation in what? For whom? For what purpose? That's hopeless. Innovation in itself is neither good nor bad. It's just a general box, and we need to see what's in the box. So it's hopelessly unsophisticated. But it's exactly the general language that business in general would like, because if everything gets waved through, then in there will be something they do want to do and make profit out of. So I think there's a difficult policy choice at the moment. I cannot understand why some countries have created exemptions to their copyright law to allow AI literally to take everything their citizens have ever done. Was there a debate with their citizens about this? Almost certainly not. Astonishing things are going on in the AI policy at the moment, and they're going on without debate very often. And that's a sign that there is a much bigger plot or plan or game here, which is to take everything. And in the course of that, and this is why we need to be clear about where we stand, maybe in relation to the worst version of China, this will change the quality of our social relations. It's changing power relations fundamentally in every society. Yes, it's changed them in China, and we certainly don't like many versions of the social credit system. Although aspects of it my students rather like, because it means that if they are trustworthy, they get a higher score and so on. You can play the game. But the idea that the bad social consequences are all in a so-called rogue society China, and they're not happening here, of this restructuring, is madness. It is happening all around us. So we need to get out of this geopolitical binary, because it's super unhelpful for seeing what's actually going on. And that's what we're trying to do in our work, to offer a framework which helps us to see the similarities between China and the West, as well as the obvious differences.
I'm going to pick your brain. I know you said, and I absolutely agree, that we should imagine a world in which power is structured differently, work towards it. I agree. But I'm going to bring to you a question that people keep pushing me for, which is for a concrete example of someone that has succeeded. I tried the Maori algorithm out and was very hesitant because I felt upon reading the story that the kind of harmony that the story seemed to imply between indigenous people, I've never seen it in India. So I was like, where did the democratic legitimacy come from? And the only person from New Zealand in the room immediately was like, look, I'm not Maori, but I have to say that I feel like it's unlikely that all of the Maori people will be like this. So I was wondering, because you've been working on this for so many years, I'm wondering if you ever ran into something that's even small, but something that we can hold out as hope. So that's the question. And the little thing that I want to rectify, because Sylvia's too modest to do it herself, is she's on the Michigan Information School faculty.
Great. Well, great you're here. Very good you're here then.
I'm gonna come up later.
Sure.
Say hello.
Okay, I guess this will probably be the last question. It's a tricky one, where actually works. I think I might want to reframe the question in a minute, but the Maori case, I haven't heard problems about that, and it was reported on by Karen Howe, whose investigative research I respect enormously, right? And she wrote about it in one of her MIT Tech Review pieces. So I haven't heard anything negative. The values are very strong behind that innovation. I think there is work going on in parts of Latin America with indigenous communities that's trying to make things work at a community level. I think this goes back to, I was going to mention this in relation to, actually, it was in relation to your question, but I didn't get there. I think one way forward, leaving aside the geopolitics at the level of general policy, is that we will find better solutions, and this is true with social media as well, if we shift the decision-making to actual communities that know what they want to achieve. That's not, of course, anti-government or romantic localism, of course, but the idea that you could moderate what people say on a scale of 3 billion people is absurd. It's totally, AI cannot do that. It's a human function. It has to be done where humans are, which is in actual communities. So I think the way I would reframe it, and this affects many parts of the world, the power asymmetries around the production of technology are so profound, and they are the long-term result of colonialism. This is just the latest version that hammers that home. That means that it's incredibly difficult to innovate outside the centers. It's staggeringly difficult. Almost everything is against you. But the chance, thinking about doing it within communities is one way forward. And I've been very inspired in writing the Space of the World book by hearing from people in the space of social media, which is a lot easier than big AI, who argue that if you talk with communities, how would they redesign social media that work for their community, you can make a lot more progress. To do that, you obviously need interoperability, you need certain types of templates that are freely available, publicly subsidized. But Gordon Gao at the University of Alberta has been doing some very interesting work. I cite that in chapter 7 of the new book. There is interesting work, at least in the area of social media, which, let's face it, is an area where many people have lost hope. They just do not know how to change this. It's a disaster, it's a car crash, but it's what we've got. But that's not true. There are people already experimenting. So I'm not without hope, but I think we have to turn it to the level of communities. And that means we have to turn the tables on those who want to judge what counts as success. It should not be businesses or business-driven journalists who say what's success. It should be communities themselves. That's where we need to start. That's where the imagination comes in. And that will challenge what is success. What are we trying to do? That's the way I would try and approach it.
Time for one more question, if anyone has one.
I want to follow up.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about, so what I'm thinking in terms of LLM, right, is that referring to your term, what is it, double helix?
Yeah.
That the form of knowledges that produce LLM and that we produce is not disconnected from the form of colonial extraction, right? Because LLMs cannot exist without that extractive practice.
Yes.
So you have to train it with so much data, and there's no way to train it without stealing data.
Yeah.
And then if you start from here, that the knowledge that produced the AI itself is not disconnected from the colonial way of thinking, then you have to start tracing, okay, where does it begin? So we can undo it. So I'm wondering, like, in terms of resistance, like, how do you trace far back? Like, where do we stop? Like, what models of AI that we should stay away from, and what is still redeemable? That's what I was trying to get at.
Well, no, that's a very good question. I've got to be honest. That's the sort of thing I'm working on at the moment for a new book, a new solo book, which is the one coming after the one on social media. So I can't give you a definitive answer on that. Ulysses and I, in the data grab book, give a general view that there's a data grab going on with AI. It's fairly obvious there is, and we can see that in a colonial way. And so at least raise the question there. But as you say, there's a much more refined question about where the turn happened. And I'm not exactly sure. I think if I had a hunch, I would say I will put it as the moment when the scientific innovation, which was the new neural net, the mathematics that went into neural net discovery, the key papers leading up to the 2012 ImageNet thing, when neural nets were much more successful than symbolic AI approaches to categorizing images. It was the moment when that was then appropriated within business because the value could be seen. That was the key turning point. It's not that people like Geoffrey Hinton are data colonialists. He's a mathematician who was, and a psychologist who was trying to make sense of how you, in his view, simulate the human brain. Slightly curious way of formulating. They were trying to simulate the brain, and then the simulation became more interesting than the brain. So I think that came with the applications, and I think what I would do, this is something that's evolving very fast now. I mean, we're part of it. Everything around us is part of this. I would advise you to have a look around at the language being used by AI in policy, in everyday use, in adverts, and everywhere. This is what I encourage my students to look at the corporate language. This is enacting for us right now a redefinition of knowledge. So the origins are not very far back. In fact, we're part of those origins right now. We're in the transformation right now, where a perfectly decent and important and profound calculative tool that enables trillions of data points to be connected in real time every microsecond in an interactive way that generates completely unimaginably higher dimensional results, which is what AI is, can be then used to convince whole societies that they should rethink how they talk to people, how they employ people, what they do in data work. That is, I call this a sort of social magic that's going on right now, or in more technical terms, there's an emerging social contract around AI. That's what my next book will be about. And I can't tell you the origins because we're actually making it right now. So the job is to try and name it and try and develop a critical take in relation to it, because if we don't, it will have evolved and got locked in when it really is then too late to change it. So I'm trying to resist that locking in, which could be 5 years away, 10 years away, we don't know exactly. So that's what my project's about. So great historical questions, but I think this time is almost, the history is evolving. We need to look into the future in order to then look back. And I can't do that. That's too hard. Thank you.
Thank you for coming all the way to
Pleasure, pleasure.
And we've been reading your work already, so it's been such an honor to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and look forward to seeing some of you this evening maybe, and for dinner maybe, and it's been great to be here. Thank you to the online audience, whoever and wherever they were.
Thank you for coming. I hope you'll visit again.
Thank you.